Canada 77%, and finally France 78%, and Germany 81% of Germans have no confidence that Donald Trump will do the right thing when it comes to world affairs.
I'm a tariff person. I've always been a tariff. It's simple, it's easy, it's precise.
Trump touched down in the Canadian Rockies with that line still hanging in the air, and he came armed, a 25% tariff on every car that crosses the border, hinting it could climb higher. In Ottawa, workers banged on steel drums outside Parliament, chanting that paychecks were being priced out of existence. By sundown, the loonie had slipped, parts trucks idled on Highway 401, and Windsor's night shift stalled. Inside the Summit Lodge, Prime Minister Mark Carney quietly shredded the old G7 Communiqué, refusing to let one man veto an entire continent. If you've made it this far, the algorithm probably didn't want you to. Subscribing helps break through that, more than you know. And what came next wasn't negotiation. It was confrontation. 12 hours after touchdown, Trump dropped the second hammer, a 48-hour ultimatum. Sign a tariff deal on his terms, or the auto levy jumps to 50% at midnight. His smirk said the opposite. Ottawa read it as a deadline, not a dialogue. By dawn, Carney fired back, draft legislation for a mirror 25% tax on U.S. SUVs and pickup frames, effective the moment Trump's clock expires. Shares in Michigan-based Magna fell 11% before the New York bell even rang. Border ripple. Auto glass supplier Guardian warned its Windsor line would idle 700 workers by Friday. Freight brokers saw 462 Canadian trucks canceled in a single scheduling cycle. Chassis sat empty at Sarnia, engines cold. Trump took the numbers as validation. He tweeted one sentence, "Pain is proof the medicine works." That line flashed across every Canadian newsfeed, then straight into union chat groups. By lunchtime, steelworkers blocked Huron Church Road, choking the bridge to Detroit. No loud hailers, just cardboard reading, "We don't beg." If this is hitting close to home, you're not alone. A quick like helps this reach others who feel the same. Trump calls this leverage. Carney calls it extortion. And the countdown he started is now ticking for both sides. Loud, public, unstoppable. By hour 18, the shockwave jumped oceans. Brussels slid into emergency session, warning that a 50% tariff on Canadian assembled SUVs would ricochet into €4 billion of parts orders across Germany, France, and Spain. Volkswagen rerouted wiring harness shipments through Mexico to dodge Trump's clock. Windsor line slowed again. Ottawa answered with its own signal. Carney, flanked by the UK and France, announced a trinational automotive resilience pact, joint purchasing, shared tooling grants, no U.S. content required. Detroit's lobbyists read the memo first. Ford stock fell 3 points in 10 minutes. The pain crossed back over the bridge. In Monroe, Michigan, a seafoam plant emailed 1-200 furlough warnings. Material flow indefinitely disrupted. Trump brushed it off on Truth Social, short-term noise, long-term win. But Wall Street noise is capital flight. The Dow Auto Index closed down 4%, erasing a month of gains. Canadian polls hardened. 78% now favor slashing U.S. imports until Washington respects parity. That number spiked 6 points overnight, the fastest opinion swing since NAFTA's birth. Trump framed it as proof his pressure works. Carney framed it as proof alliances work without him. And with every canceled purchase order, the showdown lost another buffer day. Carney moved next, silently. He dismantled the summit's script line by line, replacing the grand communique with single-issue statements no one man could veto. Climate? Issued at dawn. Supply chains? Signed by 6 at lunch. Trump could only refuse in fragments, never derail the whole. The tactic infuriated him. Reporters heard the boom first, an unscheduled press spray where he branded the new format weak-kneed bureaucracy. Cameras caught G7 aides checking phones, not faces. No one rushed to defend him. Behind those closed doors, the fracture widened. France offered Canada priority slots at its St. Nazaire port, bypassing U.S. East Coast customs entirely. Japan pledged low-interest credit for Canadian battery plants if Ottawa held a line. 2 hours later, Bloomberg's headline read, "Allies pivot to Canada's market, free of American leverage." Back home, U.S. auto CEOs flooded Capitol Hill. Tariff relief or factory downtime. Congress kept silent. Election year math is cruel. Trump doubled down instead, threatening a matching steel duty. London and Berlin pre-drafted counter-tariffs before the words left his mouth. By sunset, the G7 no longer looked like 7. It looked like 6 aligned nations and one rotating threat at the center of the table, loud, isolated, and suddenly reversible. Outside the summit walls, the streets told a clearer story. What began as union-led vigils morphed into a full-scale economic resistance movement. In Calgary, over 22,000 protesters marched under one message: no deals with bullies. In Vancouver, dockworkers refused overtime on U.S.-bound shipments. The border didn't close, but it slowed. Commercial traffic through the Ambassador Bridge dropped 17% in one day. Canadian customs agents confirmed a pattern: more inspections, longer holds, subtle pressure back on American exporters. Ottawa didn't announce it. They didn't have to. In Toronto, truckers parked rigs in front of Parliament for 7 hours, blasting horns every time Trump appeared on screen. The banners weren't diplomatic. This is not America first. This is theft. Meanwhile, Carney didn't flinch. He issued no apology, gave no reactive press conference. He let the images speak: traffic jams, empty assembly lines, and a rising chant from ordinary Canadians. Respect isn't optional. Trump posted clips of the chaos as proof of strength. But perception cuts both ways. Foreign media framed it as a country pushing back against a hostile superpower. And in living rooms across North America, viewers saw something new: a Canada that didn't cave, and a U.S. president who couldn't silence the noise. Day 3 opened with a rupture. Canada's Trade Ministry published a blacklist. 28 U.S. companies tied to Trump's tariff lobbying would face strategic procurement restrictions, effective immediately. That meant no federal contracts, no joint bids, and no access to Canadian infrastructure projects for a decade. The list hit hard: Caterpillar, GE, even a Texas logistics firm building cross-border pipelines. Within hours, their stocks bled red. Trump's reaction was instant. He accused Carney of sabotage, then threatened full-spectrum tariffs on Canadian dairy, lumber, and railcars. But Carney had already fortified his flanks. The EU signaled it would recognize Canada's restrictions under fair retaliation rules. Japan called them measured. The UK offered to fill supplier gaps within 72 hours. In Washington, Senate offices went dark. No one wanted to defend a trade war that now looked less like leverage and more like a diplomatic fire. A memo leaked from Commerce. Scenario C: Trump isolated within G7, trade alignments shift permanently. That wasn't a headline. That was internal damage control. By sundown, Trump had triggered what his critics feared most: not just a trade disruption, but a realignment of trust. He wanted to corner Canada. Instead, he cornered himself, boxed in by allies who stopped waiting and started walking. Trump came to Canada to force a deal. What he forced instead was a reckoning. He thought pressure would bring submission. It brought coordination. He thought tariffs would isolate Canada. They isolated him. The G7 didn't break. It evolved around him, without him. Carney didn't out-talk Trump. He outmaneuvered him. No theatrics. No flare-ups. Just quiet structural damage control, sealed in policy, not headlines. And now, long after the summit ends, the shift continues. Trade routes redrawn. Contracts rerouted. Trust recalculated. Because when one leader weaponizes power, others don't always fight back. Sometimes, they just walk away. Was this strategy or betrayal? You tell me. Drop a comment below.